Today we're talking about finances in dating and how it affects marriage and the importance of people talking about it when they're dating. How do you spend?
Yeah.
And what do you spend on?
Yeah.
Or like, what do you splurge on versus what are you more frugal on?
Yeah, and this definitely isn't like a first date question or conversation,
Yeah.
but something to ask when maybe you're getting a bit serious about someone and you see that it could be going somewhere.
Yeah. Our parents' generation might have thought like, oh, there's a certain population or a certain profession that can be really well off. Whereas I feel like we are more like, oh, anyone who manages their finances well, whether you're making $200K a year or $60K a year, could do relatively well if they're wise with their money year over year, kind of thing.
I feel like finances are almost like a taboo thing to talk about when you're dating.
Yeah.
You know, not everyone approaches the
especially if people aren't like direct or forward or come from families that are direct or forward about finances. Because a lot of people feel like, oh, do I tell this person how I spend or how much I make?
How much
I've saved. Yeah. And I think that it's so important because so many marriages end or experience conflict because of finances.
Yeah, and whether you plan on combining your finances or not in marriage, their financial situation is still going to impact you pretty greatly. So
yeah, Mariah and I combine our finances. We do our finances together. I think when we were dating, we got a lot of chances to see how we manage finances, and we got to see if we had alignment in that area. And I think that the key areas of focus for this conversation is like how much you spend, how much you save / invest, and then who manages the finances.
I remember someone explained to us these like different categories of spenders. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
It was like
smart saver, smart spender, freestyle saver, freestyle spender.
Free-spirited, I think.
Free-spirited?
'Cause I remember it was very like...
Oh yeah, free-spirited spender and a free-spirited spender.
Saver and spender.
Yeah, saver and spender.
Yes.
Yeah.
So basically...
So it's like 4 quadrants.
Yeah, and you could land in...
Yeah. It's like smart saver, smart spender, freestyle spender, freestyle saver.
And I remember I was a smart spender. Like I didn't spend a lot of money, but I wasn't really a smart saver. Maybe a freestyle saver.
Yeah, you're a free-spirited saver.
Yeah.
But smart spender.
Yeah, because I, before we were married, didn't have too much money tucked away.
Yeah.
But it's not like I was a big spender.
Yeah.
But it's because I was never super intentional
We were
about
also
saving.
young when we met.
That's true, yeah.
And like both students.
That's true.
Or just fresh out of school.
That's true.
But I think it's so important for people to talk about these in marriage. And I think that like, maybe let's just go through each question.
Yeah.
And give some thoughts on each.
Yeah.
So like, the first question is how you spend. This is good because people spend according to values. So it's like people spend according to values. People spend sometimes just based on instinct or like based on emotion. But I think it's important to like pay attention to and ask the question like in a direct conversation. So not just learning through observation, but also learning through like direct asking. Like how do you spend?
Yeah.
And what do you spend on?
Yeah.
Or like what do you splurge on versus what are you more frugal on?
Yeah.
And I think that like we sometimes think about this in context of like traveling with other families or other couples.
Yeah.
We just got back from an awesome vacation with a bunch of my friends. And because it was in a resort context where it was like an all-inclusive resort, there weren't a lot of choices when it comes to spending.
Like the money had already been spent.
Yeah, everyone just spends the money, goes to the resort. So it's like there's really limited opportunity for conflict or like to see how the different couples spend and splurge versus are a bit more frugal. But if we were going on like an adventure trip to Thailand or Japan or whatever, you'd probably see that a bit more. And I find that when it comes to vacations, you'll see that like, oh, some couples want to be a bit more frivolous or spend a bit more on food. Yeah. Whereas some people want to be more fragile, or not fragile, but like frugal when it comes to food. Whereas some couples are like, oh, when it comes to where we stay, that carries a lot of weight for me. Like I want to stay in somewhere that's nice. Whereas some people are like, it's more, I sleep. Yeah, it's more about what we're doing outside the room, not in the room, kind of thing. And so I find that that's like a good analogy for when you're kind of meeting someone, you could have different variances in how you save and how you spend. So some people might value grocery shopping and spending a lot on groceries, whereas some people are like, oh, you know what? I value eating out. So 3 nights a week, I'm eating out and I'm allocating like a lot of my money towards that.
Yeah.
And so it's so important to like really zero down on like not just like how do you spend, but putting yourself in scenarios and then asking specific questions.
Yeah, because it's like it's based on your values how you spend. So if you're very misaligned in your values with the person that you're with, you want to know that.
Yeah.
Like there you can have differences. For example, the grocery example he gave, that was different between us. You were more of like get the deals in groceries or get the cheapest stuff, whereas I wanted to spend more money on groceries. And so we've now like compromised. Yeah. And that's okay.
Yeah. And some people might think like, oh, I actually don't spend according to values. I just spend more spontaneously. Like,
you're the free-spirited person.
Yeah, that is a value though. You value spontaneity.
Yeah, you value being free with your money.
Yeah, so naming that and then letting your significant other see that, or learning that if your significant other is like that, is super helpful as well.
And this definitely isn't like a first date question or conversation, but something to ask when maybe you're getting a bit serious about someone and you see that it could be going somewhere with them.
And I think it's important to spend some time being critical of how you spend, and almost like not even critical, but being intentional about how you spend, and then communicating to your significant other, hey, just so you know, this is something that I do around Christmas, or this is something that I do around birthdays, or this is something that I do every quarter that is unique to me. I just need you to know this. So it's not just like being intentional with how you ask the question, but it's also being intentional with disclosing parts of yourself or values or value spending that would be unique to you, that would be helpful for your significant other.
Yeah, I was actually talking to a friend the other day, and she's super generous, and I just commented on it. I was like, you're like one of the most generous people I know. I feel like she's always like covering my meal or buying me a gift or like something like that. And I asked her like, would it be hard for you to be with someone that had like a problem with that? That might rub up against someone if you're in a relationship and maybe they don't spend that way. And she was like, oh yeah, that'd be a deal breaker for me if they didn't want me to be generous like that. I was like, oh wow, that's interesting. But it's true. Like it's a deeply held value of hers.
Yeah.
And she enjoys being able to use her money to like bless other people.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's so important to engage that conversation. Like when you come together with someone in marriage, or even like a long-term serious relationship, their spending habits affect you. So it's important to talk about those things up front. The second is how you save and invest. So some people have a really high value for saving. Some people have a really high value for investing. Some people have a high value for both.
Some people don't value it.
Some people don't value it at all. So it's important to talk about that. I remember talking to a friend recently who says like, I don't know, he said like 90% of his latent cash was sitting in a savings account. And I was like, whoa, like 90% of my latent cash, or like cash with potential, is like invested. Not used for like bills and stuff like that, is invested. And I was like, and then he started to like unpack how he values having it in a savings account because he feels a bit more secure if his cash isn't fluctuating.
Oh, okay.
So he feels like, oh, I know that money is going to stay the same.
Yeah.
And then for me, I feel like with inflation and everything, if I were to have a bunch of my money sitting in a savings account for 5 years, for example, that money is actually decreasing because of inflation. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it would make you uncomfortable that it's just sitting there not getting its potential.
Yeah, and in that moment, I realized, this is like a guy friend of mine. I was like jokingly, I said to myself, like, we couldn't date. We couldn't be in a relationship. And I was like, just because I would, it's such a value of mine to be able to invest, to be able to like see interest positively affect my money over time. Yeah. So it's like those little things, like, so you might be with someone, like, so for example, if you were like, oh, I have a high value for like just having money just sitting there. There's just something in my psyche. Yeah. I need that safety. That would be a tension point for us. Yeah. So I think it's so important for people to express their values or their expectations when it comes to like saving and investing as well.
Yeah, that's true. And especially like, I don't know, do you think that people nowadays have like a higher sense of financial literacy than our parents did because of social media?
100%. 100%.
Like I feel like it's more common for people to at least be aware of like saving and investing, whereas back in the day, I feel like people just didn't, if they weren't taught by their parents finances, then they just didn't know anything.
Yeah, I think our generation is definitely more like financially savvy. I think a part of it is like the accessibility of the information.
Yeah.
Through YouTube and TikTok and stuff like that. I think also part of it is a lot of our generation grew up with parents who didn't know a lot about finances, and we recognize like, oh, I want to set myself up and my kids up better for success than I was set up for. And so it's almost like we've like hit this gear where we want to force ourselves to learn more.
Yeah.
And recognize that like feel like building savings or investments or general financial stability is more universally accessible than we think.
Yeah.
Like I think that like our parents' generation might have thought like, oh, there's a certain population or a certain profession that can be really well off. Whereas I feel like we are more like, oh, anyone who manages their finances well, whether you're making $200K a year or $60K a year, could do relatively well if they're wise with their money year over year, kind of thing. And so I feel like a part of that is like, yeah, with the information being more accessible and with us feeling like financial stability is a bit more in reach for everyone, forces us to learn more, making us more financially savvy. Yeah. Like, I totally agree with that.
Yeah. I think too, like if you find yourself in a relationship with someone who's very different than you, or maybe they don't have financial literacy and they haven't been saving, they don't know anything about investing, I would ask them the question like, are you open to learning? Are you open to me teaching you? Are you open to maybe getting more involved in that?
Yeah.
Because I think most of the time people are open to it. It just might seem like scary or intimidating, and so they haven't done it themselves. Yeah. But if they had someone to walk them through it, then they'd be open to it.
Yeah.
But in the case where they're like, no, then maybe that's like pretty big value difference that you might want to look at.
And I think that like one factor to consider in this whole conversation is how old you are and how old your significant other is. Because like if you're watching this and you're in your 30s, it's like a different, you can approach the conversation with a bit more
expectations
for your significant other who's also in their 30s versus if you're watching this and you're 19 or 21. It's like people are still learning their philosophy in terms of financial management, so you can't necessarily say like, oh, this is how you are and this is how you always will be, because I feel like we've both grown over the last 5.5 years of marriage in terms of our convictions with finances in comparison to when we were in like our early 20s or late teens.
Like when you're in your 30s, I feel like you have like 10 years of like content, 10 years of data or evidence to look at of like how you are financially. Whereas when you're in your 20s, you don't really have that.
And I think that like we kind of alluded to this, but I did want to sneak this in before we move on. When it comes to finances, it's so important to get a sense of the other person's risk tolerance, because like, sometimes it's like saving versus investing, financial security, all that, like that whole conversation. But sometimes it's like, oh, I really see investing in real estate or really doubling down on the stock market in my future. And Mariah might say, oh, whoa, that feels like way too risky for me. And you're like, risky? That's like actually quite securing, because real estate, you know what I mean? Like, so it's so important to like almost like stress test your philosophies on risk in terms of finances and make sure that there's almost like a limited degree of difference between each other. So it's like, if I'm slightly less risky than Mariah, that's one thing. But if I'm like, oh, I will never do anything but save. Yeah. And she's like, oh, I want to be investing in the stock market. Want to be investing in gold, and I want to also be investing in real estate. Then we need to have a serious like clarifying conversation like to that end, because that could cause real friction in the future.
Yeah, I agree. I agree.
The last question is, who manages the finances?
So for us, Daniel mostly manages the finances, but I am aware of everything that's going on. Yeah. For the most part. Yeah. I feel like you are more in the trenches, but you invite me in to the trenches. Yeah. So that I know kind of generally what's going on.
I think there was a couple older couples that we've either heard of or know, where it's like one of them passed away, and it was the person who didn't manage the finances, and they were so in the dark. So I feel like it's been a driving conviction of mine that like we should both be somewhat in the loop.
Yeah.
So that you wouldn't feel like, God forbid, I pass away, or there's something that happens that
I have to
puts you in the
it.
position where you have to manage the finances, where you're completely in the dark.
Yeah.
So that's part of our thinking. But I think when it comes to who's managing the finances, I think one thing I like to say to people is like, just because it happened in your family that way, like your family of origin, doesn't mean that's how your future relationship needs to be.
So just because it was the wife, doesn't mean it always needs to be the wife.
Yeah.
Just because it's the husband.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like my mom was an accountant, so she always managed the finances between my mom and dad. But I manage the finances between, you know what I mean? I can't like impose like, oh, I've always known the wife to manage the finances, so Mariah, you have to manage the finances. It's like you have to assess who likes it better, who would be better suited for it, and go from there.
Yeah, I agree.
Anything else in terms of financial management and who manages it?
I've never met a couple where both of them equally manage the finances. Have you?
I have.
Oh, really?
I have.
Okay.
Where they're
That's
like,
kind of cool.
They have like a meeting weekly, and they really look at, okay, like what did our spending look like last week? What's it going to look like this week?
Yeah.
And they both just had a pulse on it.
Awesome.
So it could be one, could be the other, could be both, but it's important to think about it.
Well, thanks for watching, you guys. If you haven't already, please make sure to like and subscribe and comment below maybe who manages the finances in your relationship. We'd be interested to hear. Our baby's crying, so we'll talk to you next week.